ready to take your questions, and I already see a first question from Athanasios, Cyprus News Agency. Athanasios, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Athanasios, Cyprus News Agency, and Star TV Greece as well. Commissioner, I see the numbers, the figures for Greece. I see that you're now projecting growth of 6% for 2021 and a recession of 9% for 2020. That's in broad terms quite the same as your spring forecast, but still, and given the comments you have already made for the depth and the risks of these recessions, countries like Greece are still reluctant to go to the ESM and tap the full potential of the instruments that are already agreed at the European level. What could you say to those countries? Should they be more vigilant and try to explore more the possibilities that are already in place for the containment of this recession? And secondly, should they already take, let's say, reform measures to be able to exploit more the upcoming Next Generation EU and the tools that will be available when agreed? Because we now see that even this already agreed policy transmission from the EIB, from all the other funds to the real economy in Greece is not really taking place. There are restraints, but banks are still refusing to lend money to the real economy, to businesses, unless they have substantial guarantees and so on. So how are you going to answer to that practically, I mean? Thanks.
Well, thank you for your question. I think that the Greek authorities reacted quickly and quite well to this crisis, to the pandemic. Despite this fact, the risk for the economy are there, also because of the structure of the economy, of the importance of some sectors, especially tourism and transport and shipment for the Greek economy. So good reaction, but situation difficult as in other member states. As a Commission, in relation to the ESM and other instruments, we worked to make them available and to make them available without the macroeconomic conditionalities that were there when these instruments were used in previous occasions. I think we were successful in this effort, and we have these tools there, but of course it's for member states to decide if and when to use them. Finally, on our national recovery and resilience plans, I strongly support the idea that after the approval from the European Council, we have to receive these proposals from member states already this autumn, because a dialogue is very important, and you know the priorities are connected to our strategic priority in the Commission and to our country-specific recommendation, but you also know that the ownership of these proposals is to national governments.
Thank you very much. We will now move to Jorge Valero from Euractiv.
Good morning, Commissioner. I have two questions as well. The first one is, in light of today's forecast and the deficit and debt figures from May, when do you think that Spain should start implementing fiscal adjustments, and whether you think they should be part of the resilient plans in autumn or next spring in order to access the funds? And secondly, the European Fiscal Board and also Mr. Centeno in an interview with the FT today talk about the debt threshold, and they said that, I mean, they agree that this is an unrealistic goal, the 60% threshold. So they call for a review of the Stability and Growth Pact. Do you consider that the 60% threshold is also an unrealistic goal, and would you agree that it needs to be reviewed as part of the Commission's review plan of the Stability and Growth Pact?
Well, I think that for sure Spain was one of the countries with stronger impact of this pandemic and also with strong impact from the human point of view. And first of all, from our side, there is solidarity towards countries more impacted by this pandemic. The economic consequences are there in our forecast, but we were very clear on the fact that this is the time of reaction to this crisis to prevent further and more serious, even more serious than those that we already have, consequences in economy. This means that the discussion on the level of debt should not disappear, because this, in the medium-long term, remains an issue for all member states and governments, but is not the number one priority in these weeks and months. As far as the review of our fiscal rules is concerned, in fact, we launched it exactly 2 or 3 weeks before the outbreak, beginning of February, and in a certain sense, events made until now the review more than ourselves. So events are showing the importance and the necessity of having rules helping what is strongly needed after this crisis. And first of all, I would mention, as the European Fiscal Board mentioned, the effort for facilitate public investment. This discussion will be a little bit postponed. It was supposed to finish at the end of this year. We will finish it next year. I think that after the summer, it's a perfect timing because the economy are gradually recovering to reopen this discussion, and we have to do it with a strategic mindset, because the decision that we will take on the conclusion of the general escape clause, on the review of these rules next spring, will probably shape our economic policy for the years to come. So this is a very important discussion, and it is not a discussion about thresholds. It is a discussion about substance of our fiscal stance.
Thank you very much. We will now move to Marine Khan from the FT. Marine, press the speak button.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner. I want to follow up on that question also. The European Fiscal Board also raised the point about what is the criteria the Commission will look at when it thinks about when to, reverse the general escape clause. Can you give us any sense of that? I mean, are we talking about when a member state reaches its pre-crisis GDP, when they don't have to do a fiscal contraction once the rules are back? Can you give us some sense of what was going to be foremost in your mind? Because a lot of member states in the northern Eurozone would like normality to return pretty fast. And I also want to ask a question about the allocation criteria. The forecast shows that Poland clearly will suffer the shallowest recession of any member state by some distance. However, Poland is probably in line to be among the top 3 or top 5 beneficiaries of the recovery fund. How do you justify that? And surely does this not just embolden the claims that the allocation criteria is not a real reflection of the COVID-19 impact? Thank you.
Well, on the first question, I would say what I have in mind, but the discussion will be a long one and not an easy one, because the decisions that have to be taken next year are very important. From the legal point of view, what is written is that we trigger the general escape clause in case of severe downturn, economic downturn affecting the EU as a whole. We don't have precedents. This means that you untrigger the clause when this situation of severe economic downturn affecting the Europe as a whole is no more there. What does this mean? I think a good point to begin this discussion was made exactly from Niels Tiggersen and the European Fiscal Board in his paper, when he referred to the fact that we are not only referring to the fact that member states will, in 2021, be in a growth path, because this is for sure and it is obvious. But he was referring to, he was taking as a reference the situation of GDP growth of 2019. So not so much only going back to growth, but going to at least to the situation we were before pandemic. But, you know, there are several other aspects to consider, and we have to honestly say that we don't have previous experience to refer to. We only know, and this was a very clear point in the European Fiscal Board report, that we have to avoid a double-dip recession, because this risk is something that we have avoided. At the same time, we have to bring again our economies in a path of common rules and common coordination. On allocation keys, well, I don't think that in nature a perfect system of allocation keys exists. What you said about Poland is a point, but I think that the Commission's proposal was made considering the necessity to refer to solid data and not to forecast changing by the day, and to refer to structural also economic data, because we have countries not so much affected by the pandemic in terms of number of infections or casualties, but very strongly affected by the lockdowns from the economic point of view. And so this is the rationale of this allocation key. I understand that this will be one of the discussion issue for the Council, but I think that the rationale of the Commission's proposal is a good one. The perfection doesn't exist in this kind of things, I think.
Thank you. We will now move to David Carretta from Radio Radicale.
Radio Radicale, if you don't mind, I will ask my question in Italian for broadcasting reasons.
Commissioner, a question about Italy. The forecast for 2021, if we look at 2020-2021, Italy is the country that is going to be left most behind as compared to 2019. And the difference is considerable, in fact, of at least 1 point of GDP compared to the other countries, and even more compared to Germany. So what are the reasons for this? Are there structural reasons? that have to do with the situation in the country? Or is that because the structural reforms that had to be done haven't been carried out? Or what needs to be done to address the situation? Well, the main reason, at least looking at things from the current point of view, because our forecasts obviously are always snapshots that take account of the situation of what's happened so far, but we are just looking at the situation as it is at the moment. So Italy has been the European country with, I think, the longest period of lockdown. It was the first country to introduce lockdown and confinement measures, and it has started to ease them up at the same time as other countries. And we've seen the devastating impact that lockdowns have on the economy, and obviously that is something that we need to bear in mind when we say that Italy, just like France and Spain, although a little bit more than France and Spain, will suffer so badly. As to the forecasts, the ideas about the recovery next year, these are based on a number of factors. Amongst others, there's the concern about the fact that the hardest hit area has in many ways been the driving force behind the Italian economy. And of course there's also the global situation, because Italy exports a lot. But nevertheless, we expect a rebound. There will be growth, but I don't think we shouldn't focus too much on the differences between the countries, but rather on the challenges that this recovery will mean for the government and for Italy as a whole.
Thank you. We will now move to Susana Freixas.
Thank you, Susana Freixas, SIC Portugal. On Portugal, we see that the figures are quite different and worse compared to only 2 months ago. We were now talking about a recession of 9.8, which is much bigger than 2 months ago. And we also see that this is quite related to the tourism sector. What do you expect it will happen during these months? Because these are the most important months for Portugal in terms of tourism. Do you expect that in October maybe the next forecast we'll be talking an even deeper recession? Do you fear this? And still on the allocation key, even if there's no such thing like a perfect allocation key, shouldn't the leaders be talking about a different distribution key now to take into account also these figures, at least for a specific amount of money, also to take more into account the tourism? Don't we risk be distributing money in an unfair way? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, there is a difference in our summer forecast in relation to the spring forecast, and the difference is based on a worse than projected outcome in the first quarter, and a slower than expected recovery in foreign tourism, particularly in the number of flights, and also on the delayed until a few days ago reopening of the border with Spain. Several aspects brought our forecast to be more pessimistic than the spring forecast. We are not more pessimistic, also slightly a little bit more optimistic on the rebound in 2021 for Portugal, But I think that this is confirming how the uncertainty on flights, global tourism can affect, in particular, economies that are strongly connected to this. How to tackle this, I think, is one of the mission of our recovery strategy and of our recovery packages. I imagine that the allocation keys will be discussed by the leaders from all points of view, including this one. But I don't want to repeat what I already said on allocation keys.
Thank you. We will now take the last two questions, and the first is from Philip Blenkinsop.
Yep, Philip Blenkinsop of Reuters. Thank you for taking my question. I wanted to ask. You referred, I think, in your statement and also in the statement that was issued to the rising rate of infections, particularly I think it says in the United States and emerging markets. That is a section which isn't included as a risk. It almost implies that it's something that you're already taking into account, or you have taken into account in your current forecasts. Now, as you've well seen, the rate of infections in the United States in particular has been hitting record levels. I wondered if you could kind of talk about what that implies for the global economy and for the European economy specifically, in terms of the clearly the kind of potential for more lockdowns or tighter lockdowns there.
Yes, indeed. When I said at the beginning of my presentation that the road to recovery is paved with uncertainty, this is mostly linked to uncertainty, to epidemiological uncertainty, for sure. I think we heard this morning news about one of the biggest Australian cities deciding a lockdown, and these kind of local outbreaks, I don't think we have to have in mind. Well, I'm not an expert. I'm speaking for the economic attitude of consumers and investors. We don't have to think to the risk of the Spanish flu repeating, the Spanish flu experience repeating. But we have to think of the possibility that for a certain amount of time we have to live with the danger of local outbreaks. And this should bring us from one side to keep our safety measures, and from the other side to keep in mind that economic activity should regain momentum even if this kind of risks are still there. Without this basis, we wouldn't have reopened our economies. So we decided in Europe, I think very wisely, to wait, but at a certain time to reopen our economy, not at full speed, keeping measures, but knowing that we can live, we can be obliged to live with local outbreaks for the future. So for sure this is affecting the path of recovery. Uncertainty is the real problem of our economy now.
The next question will go to Tommaso Galavotti, please.
Yes, good morning. Can you hear me? I guess so.
Yes, yeah? We can hear you.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for taking my question. I will ask them in Italian, if I may, as for broadcasting reasons. Sono due domande.
I have two questions. First of all, and I'm sorry to insist on the EMS, I mean, I know that there's some insistence that there be no conditions, but Gustavo Piga, who's a well-known economist in Italy, has said that we are not happy with the EMS because that would basically hear that the importance of the fiscal compact would have to be recognised. And I'd like to ask what your comment would be to that. And secondly, I'd like to ask if everyone in the Commission agrees with the fact that the general escape clause should be removed once we're back at pre-crisis levels. So I'd like to know whether everybody agrees with that in the Commission. Well, the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM, has nothing to do with the acceptance or not of the Stability and Growth Pact. Member states share the Stability and Growth Pact. I mean, it's a common European mechanism, and we're talking about the rules and the possibility to revise, to review the rules, but the pact as such is not linked in any way to the ESM resources. What's important for the ESM resources? I mean, we all know that the ESM originally had a completely different objective, and there were macroeconomic conditionalities. I mean, by definition, of course, they were included in the mechanism. Now, we've worked on this because these macroeconomic conditionalities we wanted to remove them because we wanted to make sure that everything happened at the same time in all countries before sending in requests for credit lines. And it was said that these credit lines could only be used for health expenditure. And I think at the end of the day, we've done a good job with this. But it's up to individual governments to decide at the end of the day whether or not they want to use it. As regards future discussions about the rules for the Stability and Growth Pact, I'd like to refer you to the report from the European Fiscal Board, and Professor Tinnerson talked about this during the last meeting of the Commission. And since we don't have any precedents for this and we don't have any written rules, the benchmark that we can use in order to mark the end of the general escape clause should not just be a return to growth, but in fact a return to the previous situation. And this is true for all countries together, because the review has to apply to all countries. You know, it's not enough at 2 or 3 countries doing very well and 2 or 3 countries still struggling. The evaluation, the assessment will have to encompass all countries. And I think the comments made by the European Fiscal Board in that respect are very interesting.
Thank you. And we will take a very last question from Catherine Fior.
Hi, Catherine Fior, EU reporter. I'm just a bit curious about one aspect of the report. You say that the technical assumption is that you maintain the status quo with the UK in terms of their trading relations, but we now know that there is no intention that there will be no extension of the current transitional arrangements. And while you may be ambivalent about the impact on the UK's economy, what about, why isn't that factored into your assessments of other economies? Ireland in particular would be deeply affected by a change in the trading relationship. So I'm just a bit curious that you've stuck to the status quo, even though we are now absolutely sure and certain as of the end of June that will no longer exist.
Yes, you are right. This is a technically difficult point, but the fact is that the assumption is not referring to particular schemes of a trade agreement with the UK, because we can't do that until we don't have an agreement. So we mention the relation with the UK in the so-called downside risks, referring to a scenario with the transition ending with no agreement. No agreement is mentioned on the downside. One of the possible downside risks is a no agreement scenario. An agreement scenario will be evaluated and can be evaluated only when we will know what kind of agreement scenario we will have. So this is why technically we are assuming the situation as it is, but we are saying if there is a no agreement, we will have for sure a downside risk.
Thank you, Commissioner, for this press conference, and thank you very much for following us on EBS. And you have now another press conference at 11 on the Rapid Alert System report from Commissioner Reinders, so please stay tuned. Thank you very much.
Thank you.